What has happened to the mobile QBs? That's what we're talking about today on Stealing Bananas. I'm Ben Gretch. You can find Stealing Signals newsletter at bengretch.substack.com. With me, as always, is Shawn Siegele. You can find all of his great work over at RotoViz. And Shawn, we were doing a lot of discussion prior to the show, as usual. We often welcome our guests in by talking about a conversation they can't hear and don't know anything about. Great hosting. I think I need an award on that regard. But you made a great point to me in our discussion as we were kind of just talking through some potential topics for the show, after our college sports discussion and everything else, our baseball offseason discussion, that the mobile quarterbacks had a rough week last week, and a lot of them did not look great. You said that the Ravens were sort of fortunate to get out of that game with the Chargers with a win, that Lamar didn't necessarily look great, that Hurts, I believe you said in some ways the most important of all of the mobile QBs, did look good, and so maybe not fully that point. But obviously Josh Dobbs looks poor on Monday Night Football, and Justin Fields on Monday Night Football. They don't score a touchdown, the Bears. I mentioned to you, Fields has been used as a design runner a lot more since he came back 2 weeks ago. A career-high 12 design runs in his first game back, and then I think he had 8 more last week, although I think 3 or something were kneel downs against Minnesota to set up that final kick. So I think it was only like 5 true design runs, but still, that's a good number, and it's good. I think I've been writing in Stealing Signals. I think it's favorable for his potential to have some spike weeks down the stretch. But yeah, Dobbs may get benched. And a lot of this ties back to the conversation we had last year about how teams were combating the cover 2 shells and a lot of the ways that defenses were playing with the mobile quarterbacks and the multifaceted rushing attacks, and being able to put these defenses that were dropping back and putting a lot of smaller DBs on the field, putting them in binds at the line of scrimmage, and then able to run at a high rate last year. Famously, NFL teams ran for the best rushing yardage efficiency per carry, 4.5 yards per carry league-wide, was an all-time high. That has cratered again this year, and that's been discussed a lot. And part of it comes back to the mobile QB, something we talked about this offseason. 5 different QBs ran for over 700 yards last year. Justin Fields was first, well over 1,100. This year, you have Lamar Jackson at 574 right now. No one else really close to him. Jalen Hurts is second at 410 yards. Has 6 games left. I think if you pace that out, he's not pacing to get to 700. Fields is near at 400 yards and has only played 8 games. So maybe he will be another guy who hits 700. But it was interesting last year. We had 5 quarterbacks hit that 700-yard number, and we basically had never had that before. And it doesn't seem like we'll have that this year either. So certainly the QB rushing appears down when you just look at the surface level. I haven't done a whole forensic analysis of the entire league. But as you noted it's more relevant to think through the ways that the offenses are attacking the defenses, and the defenses have then adjusted back. And as we think about how that all matters for fantasy football, and as we look ahead to the fantasy playoffs, that the mobile quarterbacks this year don't look great. They don't look super exciting necessarily, obviously. And along with Hurts, Josh Allen is the other. Those two still clearly have the greatest ceiling of any quarterbacks in fantasy football. But there aren't a lot of these cheat code running backs, and it felt like we were heading towards more of those. Remember, Daniel Jones last year ran at a higher rate than he ever had. You look at his design rushing rate and some of those things. He was one of the 5 quarterbacks who had over 700 rushing yards. Obviously, he's injured this year, changes things a little bit. But the whole Giants offense used him as a runner a lot more. They did less of that this year. You had some of the other teams, the Marcus Mariotas of the world, like the Falcons. They were able to find some they couldn't pass at all, but they were able to find success running the ball, using Mariota's legs, etc. We just don't seem to have a lot of those examples this year. Dobbs was a glaring exception, but may have played himself out of a job.
He may have. And I think that on the surface, it's frustrating for fantasy managers who felt like maybe they hit on something that was going to help late. There are some QBs who have carried people to this point who have some tricky matchups later in the season. And Dobbs has been running. He's been moving the ball. He had that game that you broke down for the listeners where he comes in with his cape and rescues them despite not knowing his teammates' names. And then he has this performance, and then it was bad, right? But it's also interesting to hear Kevin O'Connell talk about it, where he's saying that we're going to make sure that whoever is playing quarterback is aware and understands the intent behind plays. And I don't know that that is necessarily him trying to take some massive shot, but certainly it's something that feels devastating when you hear that said about a QB who understands the intent behind plays where either Justin is the primary or based upon coverage, based upon the defensive look, how to quickly and efficiently get the ball to the right place. There are still a lot of things that are new for him, and just the margin of error when you're talking about the NFL pass game can be razor thin. Sometimes the difference between conversions and chances for catch and runs versus potential turnover-worthy plays is such a small margin of error. So you could argue that there's a lot to unpack here. It's definitely an interesting quote. But when you go back to this game and you think about the fact that the Vikings and the Bears play this game on Monday Night Football, where the Bears, arguably even do some interesting things, right? You have another very good
arguably.
You have a very good game from DJ Moore, right? He's been someone who, after the slow start, has been a huge fantasy weapon. You have a game where they get Roschon Johnson involved, and he catches 5 passes. And I have some notes about him in this week's Zero RB Universe, talking about how it's interesting that his profile that's manifested so far at the NFL level is in many ways diametrically opposed to what he did at Texas that made people so interested in him. But there's a potential for this Bears offense to be concentrated in a way that's interesting. You have Justin Fields rush, obviously, for the 59 yards. You have him, get the ball to Moore. Cole Kmet catches all 7 of his targets. And yet I say that all as a lead up to the fact that the Bears don't score a touchdown, which I feel like is the very lowest bar that you have to get over. And you go back and look at this game, Justin Fields has the 2 terrible fumbles. Joshua Dobbs has the 4 picks that he throws. And that also, in addition to the struggles of the mobile quarterbacks in a variety of ways. And you can think about Kyler Murray and the Cardinals getting embarrassed. You can think about the Cleveland Browns. Now, this is a resurgent Denver Broncos team playing a lot better. They're on a winning streak. You can see Sean Payton's, the quality of his coaching kind of taking effect and the Broncos building something now. And yet, still a rough game for the Browns. Dorian Thompson-Robinson struggles before he gets injured, takes a dirty hit, gets knocked out. PJ Walker obviously struggles in a pretty difficult game environment after that. You have a lot of different things going on for the mobile QBs. But globally, we have defenses coming up with some solutions. The thing that was just, so frustrating in this game, if you were playing Dobbs and rooting for him down the stretch, which, some listeners will know that I was, he didn't run in this game. And that part was fairly shocking. Ben, turnovers like we saw in this Bears-Vikings game were a big part of the weekend, and they've been a big part of the season. You and I were working through some stats before the show. Turnover percentage up, and passing conversions down. Obviously, the rushing yardage numbers, as you mentioned, down. All of these stats are coming together to paint a picture that listeners aren't going to be surprised is bad for scoring. One of the things that we were also talking about is sort of looking at this post-mortem. Why did certain fantasy teams make it? Why did others not? It was a year where it was difficult to separate, and certainly some of these very, very late round hits, if you weren't on them, it was going to be difficult to win. But as you look at the mobile quarterbacks and the turnover percentage, the successfulness, or in this case, the unsuccessfulness of drives. We talk again about quarterback injuries. I mentioned before how Blair's offseason research pointed to last year as the season where quarterbacks had played the fewest games, I believe, since like 2011. You were mentioning to me that 2017 was a QB apocalypse, and that is a year when you go back and look at the stats, the numbers will point you to in terms of offenses struggling. But this sort of subtle shift in turnovers going back up, that's pretty noteworthy, because the understanding of the value of a possession, we tend to think of it a lot with, coaches like Bill Belichick being, someone who really prized the ball over talent with his offensive players, the punishment of any kind of mistakes. Certainly the West Coast offense being an innovation that knocked down some of the interceptions and then led to other understanding about how you have to play offense. And it's been a very consistent, multi-decade trend in one direction. And now as teams try and figure out a way to finish off these drives, they're having a lot of trouble with it.
Yeah, so much good stuff there. Yeah, that comment about the West Coast offenses is a great one. I mean, for anyone who doesn't know the full history, certainly it meant shorter passes. It meant fewer interceptions. And in the passing history of the NFL prior to Bill Walsh and those innovations, interception rates were much, much higher in the decades prior. And to your point, I mean, we were just looking through over on Pro Football Reference, league-wide stats, season by season, per team game. It's a really fun page to just kind of look at. We were doing it together here on our StreamYard video chat that you can always watch our shows on YouTube as well. But yeah, the one stat that you mentioned, it was the percentage of drives that have ended in turnovers is up. And the scoring is down, and it's down even from last year where it was down. And the only other really comparable year in the last decade is 2017, with all those quarterback injuries. And whenever I talk about these stats, I always have to throw that caveat for 2017 because a lot of the best quarterbacks at the time got hurt. I mean, you have like Andrew Luck was a big name, missed that whole season at the time. I'm pretty sure Aaron Rodgers, one of the 2 years where he broke his collarbone, some of that stuff. But as you were just breaking all that down, Shawn, and talking through that, it was funny. It pulled me back into Tom Brady's comments from a week ago that we talked about on our second show of the week last week, and the idea of the mediocre play. And we were a little critical of that. We don't necessarily agree with that assessment. I've seen a lot of people that have agreed with it. I think from the quarterback position specifically, it's interesting. And I'm going to defend his comments a little bit here, because one of the things he talked about was the ways they're teaching the game now and some of those things. And one of the things with some of these mobile quarterbacks, one of the criticisms we've heard, and some of the offenses, and as we've gotten into more spread offenses and RPOs and more college-style offenses, is that they're not as complex. They're not teaching the old pro-style drop back and read out a defense offense. It's more like one read and then run. And I mean, like Josh Dobbs, for example, is a genius. So it's not, this is not a question of like mental acumen, but because they have athleticism, it's almost like these quarterbacks are taught differently or they play differently. They learn to, because it's funny, as you were talking about Kevin O'Connell's statements, that, not understanding the play style and whatever he's doing as the play, maybe the first read
one of the first
there.
things you think it too is, and this is something that I talked about someone overtime this week. I understand why they've done it, and you were all over the fact that they were probably going to do it. I mean, Dobbs is probably listening to those comments and saying, well, give me Justin Jefferson and I will show you that I'm willing to throw him the ball. It's like, he needs to be out on the field. He cost his team this game. I mean, if he's going to practice for a couple of weeks, you need to be out there. Now, most of the time when I feel that way about things, or many times, I find more information later that changes my mind. So I just want to throw that out there, that I'm on that as opposed to other things too.
Right. I was wrong about my read. I think that it was really minor and that Jefferson really wanted to play, based on some reports that he tried to go back into the game where he was injured initially, and that the IR was just precautionary. And we talked about all of this. I will wear that. I misread that. But Jefferson has had comments.
I think you were all over it. And the other thing I was thinking there with what you're saying is that, I mean, even just aesthetically on these offenses, as I'm watching through some of these games, I'll get to the point where be like, I feel like I've watched a quarter of play without a pass crossing the line of scrimmage. Throw the ball down the field, and the quarterback is just going to be like, that zone coverage does not give me any of those plays, and that's not the plays that are being called by my offensive coordinator.
That's the other note that I wanted to bring up from what you were discussing, and you had some favorable notes about Fields and how we got the ball to DJ Moore and Cole Kmet. Shawn, 100 air yards total in this game. He had a 2.7 yard average depth of target down the field. There have been 5 games in the NFL all year where a team had fewer than 100 air yards. This one tied for the 6th lowest. There's been a couple that have been right on 100. This was one of them. DJ Moore, 11 catches on 13 targets for 114 yards. You wind up with that really high catch rate when you are catching everything around the line of scrimmage, and you wind up with the yardage. Despite that, a lot of other receivers would only have had 50 yards on this 11 for 13 reception line. Cole Kmet, 7
52 of those yards came on that final field goal drive. And so that was the first time that they kind of unleashed him down the field. I mean, almost half on that final.
They didn't unleash him down. 53 total air yards. So maybe a lot of those did come on that final drive. I was going to say you wind up with this many yards on such a low ADOT when you're really good after the catch. I mean, he's always been a yak stud, and we saw that in this game. They were throwing to him short, and he's like a fullback out there. I mean, like a more fast fullback. No, that's not. I don't say that pejoratively. I mean, he's difficult for cornerbacks to tackle on the perimeter. It's a kind of thing that, like, for years in Carolina, I was like, why won't they just throw him the ball around the line of scrimmage? We talked about this in 2019 or whatever, years ago. Let this guy get these easy throws. He will gain yardage for you. You'll get successful plays out of just throwing him the ball at the snap. We talked about it with A.J. Brown in Tennessee a lot. It's so funny to see it now in a season where I'm not as on DJ Moore, but also be like, I argued with so many people about this, and I was right. And I want to go back and find this. But he looks incredible after the catch and was in this game. Cole Kmet, you mentioned the 7 catches on 7 targets, 1.7 ADOT, goes for 43 yards. Comparatively, it's like 6 yards a catch for him. For DJ Moore, still winds up over 10 yards a catch, even though his ADOT is 4.1. I mean, that's because DJ Moore's really, really good is the point I'm getting at. But it's funny, as you were just saying that about them not pushing the ball downfield and watching a whole game. And I mean, that literally was the Bears-Vikings game. I mean, that's what we saw. And every time the Vikings threw downfield, it was intercepted. So, like, it was hard to watch. It was hard to watch. But I'm with you on the Jefferson thing. And I wasn't trying to be, like, too self-critical or anything. I do think I misread that. At the same time, I have the exact same opinion. And part of the reason I think I misread that is just recently, since he's been eligible, Jefferson has had his own comments. He's been frustrated with fantasy managers that are coming into his mentions on social media and saying, I need you out on the field and all this stuff. And he talked about his own health and he needs to get right. Hearing him say that, I was like, whoa, I was wrong. I had a read on it that Jefferson was itching to get back out there and the team wasn't going to be able to keep him back. And the fact that they weren't activating him before the bye here, I felt like was in some ways doing him a disservice because he has talked about stats and about wanting to put up numbers and wanting to be a Hall of Fame player. It's part of the reason I thought that he would be back at the minimum on IR because he just wouldn't accept missing 7 games in a season. It's not up to him, and I'm not trying to say that he did accept that by any means, but it certainly was a situation where it was eye-opening for me to hear some of his thoughts that maybe he's a little bit more injured than I thought. But I completely also agree with you that I watched this game and thought, man, the Vikings are in a playoff push, and they win this game with Justin Jefferson. There's no question. I mean, they lose 12-10. The 4 interceptions and the inability to get anything going in the vertical passing game. I mean, even though they were 1 game away from the bye and teams always hold the guy out that game because you then get 2 more games of resting, I was like, man, you really he did have 6 weeks off. You really didn't look at this game with. I mean, I feel like they probably felt like they could win without him so confidently that they didn't activate him, especially with it being a Monday night. You get that extra day, and then you have the bye behind it. So if he sore it all or whatever, you can manage his reps in that 1 game. If he sore it all, you get the extra week for him to then rest again. I knew they weren't going to activate him for this game before the bye. I thought it was a little odd that that they did it from a competitiveness standpoint for the reasons that you said. And again, it could have been purely health. And like you said at the end of your last statement, you find out things later that then you're wrong about. I feel the same way, but I had the same read you did, where it was like, man, they probably should have pushed to get him ready. I can't imagine that he couldn't have played, like you said, when he had been doing limited practices now for 3 full weeks. And they've now since already activated him off IR because they had to, because you get a 3-week practice window and then you have to activate him or he's converts to full season IR. So they activated him this week and had to cut somebody to do it prior to their bye, right? So they were already going to have to make that move as well. It's all just a little bit like, why weren't you ramping him up from limited practices to full practices last week and then having him ready for Monday Night Football and then giving him an extra week on the bye week to then rest and see how it responds? In hindsight, and I'm not a doctor, in hindsight, when you lose 12-10 and you can't do anything in the passing game, it seems like they probably wish they would have done that and maybe took it a little, because, you know, victims of their own success a little, but they're winning every game without him. They went on that big, long winning streak. Eventually that runs out. You lose to a Chicago Bears team that, you have to beat.
You lose, and you also now have put yourself in a situation where you may make a quarterback move that lowers your ceiling in the final third of the season and probably takes you out of any realistic shot at being competitive with the types of teams that you're going to face in the playoffs. And so we see that from him. But, when we're talking about Dobbs having a bad game, it's not just the guys who have been forced into play. I mean, Lamar Jackson was excruciatingly bad against a Chargers team that I think you have to exploit. And you look at this game where Isaiah Likely leads them in yardage. And it's a little bit like these games where we point where JSN has led the Seahawks in yardage. You're like, this guy that we're kind of rooting for led the, you're like, how many yards though? Because if it's under 40, then no one led. Everyone trailed. Like, how far trailing were you? Right. And
there's been, as somebody who's written a lot of game breakdowns with stealing signals over the years, there have been way more games this year where nobody is over 40 receiving yards than I can ever remember. It's crazy.
And you look at this game, and Zay Flowers has been a star for them, and he scores 2 touchdowns for them. But Ben, he has 8 targets, and he finishes with 25 yards. If anything, that's still more of a problem when you look at where they are than the fact that he had a 2-touchdown game. They did use Keaton Mitchell a little bit more. Keaton Mitchell looked extraordinary. I'm starting to think that it's not that hyperbolic to be comparing him to Achane. They look so similar when they're out there. He had at least 4 big plays in this game. And even with that being the case, I mean, they're up 13-10 late in a game where the Chargers obviously are struggling to run the ball. They're struggling to throw the ball. They had a 3-possession sequence where they turned the ball over all 3 times.
Yeah, 3 lost fumbles, I was going to say. I mean, that's not going to help.
When you have that type of an environment, and as the Baltimore Ravens, who I think you would have to argue are at least like maybe they're tiny favorites over the Chiefs right now as the AFC top dog. I mean, it's a bad situation for them. And their offensive coordinator came out after the game and said, we have to score more. And so you're seeing these teams, elite teams pushing for the playoffs. Obviously, you have a situation that is apples and oranges, but you have Frank Reich getting fired with the Panthers. Teams that don't have play like what you're getting from CJ Stroud are saying, we've got to do better. It's interesting. I keep going back. I wrote a lot again this week on the situation with Buffalo and them firing their offensive coordinator when Buffalo is one of the few teams that's actually explosively moving the ball. And yet, again, the turnovers that has been the other thread working through this has been a huge issue for the Bills. And the thing that it kind of brings to mind for me is Mike Martz and The Greatest Show on Turf, where his innovations were like, we're going to blow you out. We're going to put up so many yards that we're going to bury you even if we lose the turnover battle. And, how much of what the Bills are doing has some trade-offs with explosiveness for risk. And so I think that's an interesting question. But you have the Vikings potentially benching Dobbs. You also have this kind of under the radar, but potentially very relevant move with the Cleveland Browns, where my understanding is that they have moved Joe Flacco to the backup behind DTR. And
Sounds
so
like he's probably going to start this week, Flacco.
And so this is another situation where a team has kind of moved in a different direction and said, we're going to take a statue in getting rid of the ball, because Joe Flacco is basically a longer throwing, very poor man's version of what we talked about with Tom Brady in his final year, where you're going to have the snap. Joe Flacco is going to have made his pre-snap read, and he's going to throw it. And, whatever happens, but there's not going to be like letting the play develop.
No.
Right. Whatever he saw pre-snap, the ball is going to go out, and then receivers are going to somehow have to make plays. It's the very opposite end of the spectrum from what you get with the mobile QB.
Yeah, with Flacco though, this is where we're at in 2023 in fantasy football. I'm thrilled. And I don't even have a lot of Browns players on any of my teams, so I'm maybe scared from that perspective. But just from the perspective of like fantasy scoring, I think you have to be excited if you have Browns players. What you just described is going to lead to the potential for a 60 pass attempt game. I mean, he's had some of them, right? It's probably not going to be 60, but you probably have 40 plus pass attempts and push 30 completions. And in PPR leagues, we kill for 30 completions. One of the things when I wrote about Tim Boyle this week that I found so hilarious was that I went back to look at Zach Wilson and try to describe the difference, because Tim Boyle was not good, but he was bad in a different way than Zach Wilson has been bad. And the way that I tried to describe that, and I don't even necessarily think he's better than Zach Wilson, because he was really bad in the ways that he was bad. And Wilson, I think, has arm talent and shows some interesting things. And Boyle just basically threw quick underneath and really wasn't able to do anything. It was gross. And we knew it was going to be gross. We wish they would have done something else other than Tim Boyle, anything else. We talked about this last week. This guy in his time, what was it, at UConn or whatever, had the one TD and 13 interception TD to interception ratio. But he had 27 completions in this game. Zach Wilson, in all of his starts, I think had 3 games where he was at 20 or more. If you go look at Zach Wilson's game log, it's a whole bunch of 14 completion, 17 completion, 18 completion games, because he's not actually throwing that much. He's taking sacks, he's scrambling around, whatever. And then he's not completing a high rate of passes. Boyle, because he's throwing underneath short passes, completes 71% of his passes in this game, in this loss against Miami, most of them in garbage time. But he ends up throwing 38 passes.
And, the dropbacks are going to be even much higher, because he juices his completion rate a little bit by taking 7 sacks.
Yeah. It wasn't good. None of it was good. They only ran the ball, recorded 10 official rush attempts in the entire game. Breece Hall, to me, more targets than rush attempts in this game. But still, it's not like I'm not saying that Boyle's good. He winds up with 179 pass yards on 38 attempts. That's bad. Anytime you're talking about less than 5 yards per attempt, that's not what you're looking for. And yet he and taking 7 sacks and throwing 2 picks and fumbling twice. All of it was terrible. He was not good. And yet, for fantasy purposes, right? Like, the ability to complete a certain number of passes is something that I will take in 2023. Like, you're at least getting us some PPR points and getting the ball into the receiver's hands. Although this is a team with 27 completions that almost fits your description from a minute ago, where the team leader, Garrett Wilson, on his 10 targets had 44 receiving yards. We didn't even get a player to 50 receiving yards. He had 4.4 yards per target. He caught 7 of the 10 balls. He had a 70% catch rate and still only 4.4 yards per target. That's an insane stat, and it's because the only thing that he was really getting thrown are curls and short passes. And it's not really even necessarily a knock relative to what I was just saying about DJ Moore's yak ability, because in this case, there's not even like a threat anywhere else. Like, they're going to tackle you right after you catch the ball. He was making some interesting moves after the catch in this game, actually, Garrett Wilson, that I was hopeful that he would break something, but it's different. Like with the Bears, Fields rushing and the design runs and those things, allow for some of the yak, and then they're running like wide receiver screens. These aren't wide receiver screens. These are curls, but they're just like 4-yard curls. And then he's catching the ball with his back to the defender and no blockers. And I mean, you're not going to get yak in that situation. So anyway, it's not good. I'm not saying it's good with Boyle, but at least the completions, and the same with Flacco. I mean, I almost would like to go back to some of these pocket passers, and maybe we get, some things going positively in that direction. But, Boyle is not a good example of a positive version of that, and Flacco may not be either. But I mean, that's something I wanted to ask you about, because when you posed this hypothesis to me and said it was a bad week last week and it's been kind of a bad year for the mobile quarterbacks coming off a year that was a great year and we thought was a big part of the offenses that overperformed in 2022 was QB mobility. Is there an element where for you would like to see more of the traditional drop back pocket passers, probably what Tom Brady was referring to, guys that are more able to read out coverages and get to their second and third reads and stand in the pocket? And, Tom Brady in his prime and Phillip Rivers in his prime and Drew Brees in his prime, these guys aren't, walking through that door. We don't have the same level of quarterback talent in the NFL right now. But is that something that we should be more open to in 2024 and going forward?
I do think that the success of Stroud, and you contrast that with the limitations that Bryce Young as a smaller QB, you contrast that with the passing limitations and the injury from Anthony Richardson. I mean, partly it's just like, yeah, you would obviously prefer to have a generational passer if your goal is to be in the mix to, get into the Final Four in your conference year after year for a decade, 12, 15 years, that type of thing. But there aren't that many of those. We do want to protect them. Just every week we kind of have this conversation about injuries and protecting QBs. There was this incredibly weird play in the Chargers game where you look at that game where they're down 13-10 late, as I mentioned. And that's a situation where on one of their first drives, I think maybe their first, but early on, Justin Herbert is hit way out of bounds. And instead of having that flagged, his teammate gets flagged for, being frustrated with the dirty play.
Yeah.
And so instead of having a first and goal, you've got a 3rd and 1,000,000. And again, where's the disincentive to come hit these guys? I don't think that the end game for offenses can be horizontal, right? Your solution to what defenses are doing is not to have everything be at the line of scrimmage. And one of the problems that the Chiefs have had this year is they become very horizontal as they try and create enough successful plays to sort of offset all of these deep mistakes. When you have MVS, never making any plays, when you're not converting those splash plays, you do have to string together a lot of successful plays, which means you have to figure out some type of innovation, like what, Bill Walsh did with the West Coast offense, where you can have plays that are explosive enough and yet do have a high success rate element to them. But you're not going to be able to allow defenses to sit back and then just play ferociously downhill on you. And that's one of the things that we saw in this game this past week with the Browns, where the Broncos, whether or not you believe those hits are dirty, were playing downhill at a crazy rate on that Browns offense. And you have to be able to force them out of that. Now, you look at the mobile QB, the young QB in Thompson Robinson there, and one of the things that hurt him in this game and made his stats look worse than they actually are is that his teammates dropped a bunch of passes. And so the very first thing that's going to have to happen if you're going to have enough successful plays against this style of defense is just, your teammates have to come through and catch the ball, but we know that that's not always possible. Even some of the things like the Njoku drop in the end zone, the defender gets his hand on that ball. Anybody who's played any time to catch themselves knows that when you have someone else batting the ball away, it adds another level of difficulty. So it's difficult, but you have to be able to attack in some way, shape, or form. And I do think that the pocket passer is a part of that. And someone who is big enough and talented enough, has the arm strength, has the ability. Really, again, you kind of want the Stroud Herbert type of player. Herbert had some really long runs in this game as well. It continues to be bizarre that the Chargers just always lose because Herbert is playing at an incredible level, and QB play tends to dictate everything that happens for the NFL. But Stroud's ability to attack down the field and to extend plays in the pocket, and that's the thing that we're seeing also from a Patrick Mahomes, even in a terrible season like this, where I, kind of was joking with you last week that he wouldn't be on my MVP ballot at all. And yet, mostly when he struggled, it was in the two games where they lose to the Lions and lose to the Eagles, two of the best teams in the NFL, where his guys just drop an absurd number of passes. I mean, he's not responsible for that. It's that difficult element, though, where I do think that we're getting to this point where your QB has to be able to do both things and things that in some ways are opposed, where I don't think that you need a mobile QB per se. And so much of what we saw with Lamar Jackson this week, where they're quick throws that are short. Well, that doesn't help you take advantage of what he can do, which is to move around. Now, he has a great scramble on a 3rd and long that he converts and is one of the big plays in this game. You still see the value of Lamar Jackson and his transcendent rushing ability. And yet I would argue that their offense has to be structured a little bit better to take advantage of his vertical passing and his rushing. It's almost neutralizing both things right now. And so partly your offensive coordinator has to be good. We need a development of coaches. And so, we criticize Tom Brady. I've argued that, his coaches are having a hard time keeping up with the innovations. And yet coaching increasingly, I think, if you're going to have these defenses, is going to be the most important thing. You look at, and probably it's just, there's a coincidental aspect to it, but the firing in Pittsburgh, along with the breaking of the yardage streak, I mean, the coaching is going to matter, but you're going to have QBs that can throw down the field and can extend plays. And that's, again, not exactly what Tom Brady was doing either, right? I mean, the problem that he ran into down the stretch is that inability to extend the play. It's getting tougher, and the demands on the QB are going to continue to become greater. The teams who are going to thrive. And, again, we have the Bills, and they're controversial because they've lost all these close games. You had mentioned in our previous show when we were talking about this, that 2021 season. And if anything, it was even crazier, where they were alternating, like winning by 50 and losing by 2 over and over again. You have to have that type of quarterback, and we'll see if college can develop it. We'll see if when teams have the choice at the top of the draft, that we make that move correctly. I mean, one of the things now is that the Carolina Panthers, by missing on that pick, have probably set their franchise back. And by missing, I mean, Bryce Young could still end up being a viable starter, but not to have chosen the generational prospect after what they gave up. And again, I mean, DJ Moore emphasizes what they gave up even more, just what he's done all season, but again, in this most recent week, the margins for organizations as they try and deal with the current defensive environment is going to be very thin, because you have to have that star and you cannot miss when you get your shot.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting about your Brady notes, because, I mean, he did always get the ball out quickly, but when he did it successfully, I mean, part of what he did well late in his career, and I think Peyton Manning did well late in his career, and a lot of these quarterbacks are able to do as they build the increased experience in those things, is make the decision pre-snap based on the defensive alignment of where the ball is going to go. So, like, this is one of the things I've talked about with that subset of data that is being referred to as first read targets, because I've heard it used a lot from the pass catcher's side as evidence that the team is drawing up plays for the pass catcher. And certainly, that's the case in some situations, but the data sets are, a huge percentage of the overall targets, these first read data sets. And we're not privy to what the plays actually are. Teams are not going to tell you that. Derek Carr, in his I loved it in his interview this week. I think it was kind of misunderstood the way that I saw it referenced on Twitter a couple of times, but he literally was like, we're working on the red zone offense issues. I mean, you can keep asking this question 100 different ways. We're not going to tell you what we're doing schematically, the players we're focusing on, the things that we're doing. Like, yeah, we're working on things, and I'm not going to tell you what those things are. because of course they're not. He knows that their opponents are also going to, find out that like, oh, yeah, we're really going to work on getting Taysom Hill involved more. We're going to use him as a runner. We're going to do all the, like, I mean, you don't say that, right? Like, and so it's all platitudes. And I love that he just kind of pulled the curtain down and was like, I'm going to say a lot of words. He actually lived, this is like, I think a quote. I'm going to say a lot of words and say nothing at all. And it's like, that's what all football quotes are. That's what, I mean, and that's also then what the articles that are written on those quotes become in a lot of cases. That's why you love the analysts who really get into the X's and O's and what the teams are trying to do and what they're disguising. One of my favorite things of this season was when Mike McDaniel was in Germany and we had the I think it was a British, if I don't want to be rude, I'm not 100% certain, but I think it was a British journalist at the Germany game asking McDaniel a question that he kind of breaks down his whole offense and the evolution of his offense. And McDaniel kind of cuts him off and he's like, how cool is this? But he's also like, stop telling everyone everything. Like, I don't need the opposing defensive coordinators we're about to play to have you show them how to break down our offense and like what the things they need to be doing from a film study perspective are. So he pretty intelligently, I thought, was pivoting to just being like, I love the question that you're asking, but also let's not ask it when the cameras are around. I'll talk to you later. Like, I'll be happy to give you whatever you want to know. But they're hiding all of this stuff for a reason. It is not, information that we're privy to. And so when you talk about stuff like the first read targets and those things, we don't know who the plays are actually drawn up for or who the first read is supposed to be. But one of the things that happens with that kind of data is it looks like a first read on every Tom Brady throw, basically, because he's making a decision at the line that his backside slant is where he's going to the ball. It might have been the fourth read, the backside to come back to when the play's drawn up. There's all this stuff happening over here, but then he sees that the safeties are so rolled over to that side. There's so much congestion over there. He basically has one-on-one on the backside slant, and he decides pre-snap, I'm throwing the ball to the backside slant. I mean, you can understand that based on the defensive alignment, based on where the safeties are and what he's seeing, that he knows there's going to be space where this one route is going to break. And it may have been the fourth read pre-snap is sort of the idea. And you have quarterbacks that have talked about this as they've broken down plays and games and those things. One of the issues with no longer having that generation of quarterback, we just talked about, Rivers and Breeze and Brady and Peyton Manning and Rodgers isn't playing anymore. Rodgers is one of the most notorious at it. He famously runs the play clock down to 2 every single time, and his teams never run enough plays. When we do the analyses for fantasy football, we don't get the play volume we want out of Aaron Rodgers' offenses because he takes so much time pre-snap to make the decision, to call the play at the line, which is what Manning famously did for years and years, and Brady did, especially more and more late in his career. And so I talked last week a little bit about, we never really saw Brady against these defenses with the cover 2 shells and those things. And I mean, we did last year, and he wasn't good last year, and he struggled a little bit in 2021. But he may have been able to diagnose some of this stuff pre-snap. It is interesting to think through the fact that there are a lot of these younger quarterbacks. And again, to get back to the point about mobile quarterbacks that maybe at the college level aren't learning enough complexity in their offensive schemes because coaches are trying to simplify it for them and then allow their athleticism to be that other answer when you get to the second or third read. It's just, okay, go run now. I mean, and that is something that happens with mobile quarterbacks. It can be a crutch. It can help you now, but it maybe doesn't develop the skills necessary to be a long-term great quarterback at the NFL level eventually someday. But it's so interesting, you mentioned Stroud, to look at how Stroud is playing as he steps on the NFL. I mean, we are seeing one of the best. It makes it that much more impressive, but it is not a promising passing environment right now in 2023 football. The defenses are winning. No quarterbacks are succeeding, and you're having the greatest rookie quarterback season maybe of all time in that environment. I mean, that is crazy. It's crazy. And he's a top 5 quarterback potentially right now as a result. But it does offer a glimmer of hope that there are skills that you can have at the quarterback position that can beat these defenses, right? And that some of the other, and it just might be, there's 32 franchises right now, right? And by this point in the season, there's always 5 or 7 that have no answers at quarterback. The Jets are playing Tim Boyle. I mean, half of this stuff is like, we'll just wait till 2024 to see what happens for those teams. But on the other, 25 teams or whatever it is, you're always going to have some that are a little bit more in transition or they're developing something or what have you. Right now, a lot of those other 25 teams are on young answers, and they're hoping to develop something. And some of those guys are going to develop, and they're going to get better at making those decisions pre-snap and at the line of scrimmage and those things. There is the potential for growth, I guess. A guy like a Sam Howell, who we love around here, is mobile, has been competitive. He's taken a ton of sacks. Some of the things that people were concerned about have shown. He's thrown some picks, but he's been aggressive. He's the kind of guy that if he gets the chance to continue to be a quarterback at the NFL level for 5 years, you could see being better later in his career, much like Ryan Fitzpatrick, who he's often compared to, was later in his career. Once you learn those pre-snap reads and you learn, I'm going to go, and then you take some of the heat off yourself to hold the ball too long on some downs because you're able to decide at the line of scrimmage, I'm not going to go to the front side of the play. I'm going to go to my fourth read on the backside and make that throw with a quick time to throw, like Tom Brady did on basically every snap late in his career. More downs like that keeps you from getting hit every single play throughout the game. We just need some of these young quarterbacks to start to build some of that stuff into their game, right? And that takes experience. It takes time in a lot of cases. But the Stroud thing is a glimmer of hope. And when you're talking about Herbert and some of these guys, I mean, Herbert is playing at an incredibly high level. I see it too. I couldn't agree more. And it is hilarious or tragic, depends. But the fact that they're always losing, they're always down by 3, and with 2 minutes left in the game, I don't know how. I mean, every time I look at their games when I'm watching 6-8 games on a Sunday morning, like I'm seeing amazing Herbert stuff all throughout 3 quarters, and then I look at the fourth quarter and I'm like, hey, I haven't checked the score there in a while. They're down 3 points. How? Like
they're going to be losing.
They're going to be losing.
Well, and I think that the stuff with Brady and the stuff sort of globally, again, goes back to some of the points that you have made so eloquently throughout the course of last year and then this season, where it's not just the cover 2 shell, but it's sort of the this and that defense. And you had some really cool stuff too, wrote about someone stealing signals, but hypothesizing that defenses are not done yet and are going to continue to get better. And then we had a couple of weeks where teams went over and it looks like, well, maybe offenses are punching back. And yet the overall trend has still been down. And so I think that article, which came out right before a couple of good weeks for offense, is actually one of the coolest things from this NFL season, because I think that defenses are doing that. And I think that this element where, like, okay, well, Tom Brady can get to the fourth read before the play even starts. Defenses are drawing up their coverages in order to, I wouldn't say trick, but the tactics on defense are interesting because there are a lot of defensive looks where they actually want the QB to get to that read pre-snap, make that throw. And because of the in-possession tactics, the defense still wins, which is one of the reasons that, Patrick Mahomes is standing out there forever sometimes. Now, part of it is that, his receivers have probably not played well, but part of it is that they're trying to look for solutions to beating those types of things as opposed to taking something pre-snap. And it's difficult to tell because the Chiefs receivers are probably not good. And yet the ridiculous and utter foundational shifts in Mahomes' profile in so many different elements of it through the last 4 years and how it shifted what he does and what they do. And you're talking about Andy Reid and Patrick Mahomes. It definitely creates a world in which, we don't know what some of those great quarterbacks would have done. And so it's been really fun having this conversation with you, Ben. I can't wait to see how offenses and defenses attack it in the future. And don't worry, we're going to have more fantasy stuff for you all over the next several weeks. We're going to have postmortems on teams that didn't make it, teams that did, what we're rooting for, how we can attack the 2023 results in the 2024 offseason. So much to go here. We have some teams that need to win this week to continue to have a chance on the FFPC. That they're loaded. We're excited about those. Good luck, everyone, tonight. Good luck this weekend. We love you. We're rooting for you. We'll talk to you soon.